Chapter 19. South Call. 7:30 a.m., May 11th, 1996. 26,000 feet. Turning and turning in a widening gyre, the Falcon cannot bear the Falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. William Butler Yeats. The Second Coming. When I wobbled back to Camp 4 around 7:30 Saturday morning, May 11th, the actuality of what had happened, of what was still happening, began to sink in with paralyzing force. I was physically and emotionally wrecked after having just spent an hour scouring the South Call for Andy Harris. The search had left me convinced that he was dead. Radio calls my teammate Stuart Hutchison had been monitoring from Rob Hall on the South Summit made clear that our leader was in desperate straits and that Doug Hansen was dead. Members of Scott Fisher's team, who'd spent most of the night lost on the call, reported that Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers were dead. And Scott Fisher and Mukalu Gao were believed to be dead or very near death, 1,200 feet above the tents. Confronted with this tally, my mind balked and retreated into a weird, almost robotic state of detachment. I felt emotionally anesthetized, yet hyper-aware, as if I had fled into a bunker deep inside my skull and was peering out at the wreckage around me through a narrow, armored slit. As I gazed numbly at the sky, it seemed to have turned a preternaturally pale shade of blue, bleached of all but the faintest remnant of color. The jagged horizon was limned with a corona-like glow that flickered and pulsed before my eyes. I wondered if I had begun the downward spiral into the nightmarish territory of the mad. After a night at 26,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, I was even weaker and more exhausted than I had been the previous evening after coming down from the summit. Unless we somehow acquired some more gas or descended to a lower camp, I knew that my teammates and I would continue to deteriorate rapidly. The fast-track acclimatization schedule, followed by Hall and most other modern Everesters, is remarkably efficient. It allows climbers to embark for the summit after spending a relatively brief 4-week period above 17,000 feet, including just a single overnight acclimatization excursion to 24,000 feet. In 1996, Rob Hall's team spent just 8 nights at Camp 2, 21,300 feet or higher before setting out for the summit from base camp, which is a pretty typical acclimatization period nowadays. Prior to 1990, climbers commonly spent considerably more time at Camp 2 or higher, including at least one acclimatization sortie to 26,000 feet before embarking for the top. Although the value of acclimatizing as high as 26,000 feet is debatable, since the deleterious effects of spending extra time at such extreme altitude may well offset the benefits. There is little question that extending the current 8 or 9-night acclimatization period at 21,000 to 24,000 feet would provide a greater margin of safety. Yet this strategy is predicated on the assumption that everyone will have a continuous supply of bottled oxygen above 24,000 feet. When that ceases to be the case, all bets are off. Searching out the rest of our crew, I found Frank Fishbeck and Lou Kasisch lying in a nearby tent. Lou was delirious and snowblind, completely without sight, unable to do anything for himself, muttering incoherently. Frank looked as if he were in a severe state of shock, but he was doing his best to take care of Lou. John Taskey was in another tent with Mike Groom. Both men appeared to be asleep or unconscious. As rickety and feeble as I felt, it was obvious that everyone else except Stuart Hutchison was faring even worse. As I went from tent to tent, I tried to locate some oxygen, but all the canisters I found were empty. The ongoing hypoxia, coupled with my profound fatigue, exacerbated the sense of chaos and despair. Thanks to the relentless din of nylon flapping in the wind, it was impossible to communicate from tent to tent. The batteries in our one remaining radio were nearly depleted. An atmosphere of terminal entropy pervaded the camp, heightened by the fact that our team, which for the preceding 6 weeks had been encouraged to rely thoroughly on our guides, was now suddenly and utterly without leadership. Rob and Andy were gone, and although Groom was present, the ordeal of the previous night had taken a terrible toll on him. Seriously frostbitten, lying insensate in his tent, at least for the time being, he was unable even to speak. With all our guides or to combat, Hutchison stepped up to fill the leadership vacuum. A high-strung, self-serious young man from the upper crust of English-speaking Montreal society. He was a brilliant medical researcher who went on a big mountaineering expedition every 2 or 3 years, but otherwise had little time for climbing. As the crisis mounted at Camp 4, he did his best to rise to the occasion. While I tried to recover from my fruitless search for Harris, Hutchison organized a team of 4 Sherpas to locate the bodies of Weathers and Namba, who had been left on the far side of the col when Anatoly Bukreev brought in Charlotte Fox, Sandy Pittman, and Tim Madsen. The Sherpa search party, headed by Lok Bachiri, departed ahead of Hutchison, who was so exhausted and befuddled that he'd forgotten to put his boots on and to try to leave camp in his light. Smooth-soled liners. Only when Lokpa pointed out the blunder did Hutchison return for his boots. Following Bukreev's directions, the Sherpas quickly found the 2 bodies on a slope of gray ice freckled with boulders near the lip of the Kangshung face. Extremely superstitious about the dead, as many Sherpas are, they halted 60 or 70 feet away and waited for Hutchison. Both bodies were partially buried, Hutchison recalls. Their backpacks were maybe 100 feet away, uphill from them. Their faces and torsos were covered with snow. Only their hands and feet were sticking out. The wind was just screaming across the col. The first body he came to turn out to be Namba, but Hutchison couldn't discern who it was until he knelt in the gale and chipped a 3-inch thick carapace of ice from her face. Stunned, he discovered that she was still breathing. Both her gloves were gone, and her bare hands appeared to be frozen solid. Her eyes were dilated. The skin on her face was the color of white porcelain. It was terrible, Hutchison recalls. I was overwhelmed. She was very near death. I didn't know what to do. He turned his attention to Beck, who lay 20 feet away. Beck's head was also caked with a thick armor of frost. Balls of ice the size of grapes were matted to his hair and eyelids. After clearing the frozen detritus from Beck's face, Hutchison discovered that the Texan was still alive, too. Beck was mumbling something, I think, but I couldn't tell what he was trying to say. His right glove was missing, and he had terrible frostbite. I tried to get him to sit up, but he couldn't. He was as close to death as a person can be and still be breathing. Horribly shaken, Hutchison went over to the Sherpas and asked Lokpa's advice. Lokpa, an Everest veteran respected by Sherpas and Sahibs alike for his mountain savvy, urged Hutchison to leave Beck and Yasuko where they lay. Even if they survived long enough to be dragged back to Camp 4, they would certainly die before they could be carried down to base camp. And attempting a rescue would needlessly jeopardize the lives of the other climbers on the col, most of whom were going to have enough trouble getting themselves down safely. Hutchison decided that Lokpa was right. There was only one choice, however difficult. Let nature take its inevitable course with Beck and Yasuko, and save the group's resources for those who could actually be helped. It was a classic act of triage. When Hutchison returned to camp, he was on the verge of tears and looked like a ghost. At his urging, we roused Tasky and Groom and then crowded into their tent to discuss what to do about Beck and Yasuko. The conversation that ensued was anguished and halting. We avoided making eye contact. After 5 minutes, however, all 4 of us concurred. Hutchison's decision to leave Beck and Yasuko where they lay was the proper course of action. We also debated heading down to Camp 2 that afternoon, but Tasky was insistent that we not descend from the col, while Hall was marooned on the south summit. I won't even consider leaving without him, he pronounced. It was a moot point, regardless. Kasich and Groom were in such bad shape that going anywhere was out of the question for the time being. By then I was very worried that we were headed for a repeat of what happened on K2 in 1986, says Hutchison. On July 4th of that year, 7 Himalayan veterans, including the legendary Austrian Bergsteiger Kurt Diemberger, set out for the summit of the world's second highest mountain. 6 of the 7 reached the top, But during the descent, a severe storm struck the upper slopes of K2, pinning the climbers in their high camp at 26,250 feet. As the blizzard continued without let-up for 5 days, they grew weaker and weaker. When the storm finally broke, only Diemberger and one other person made it down alive.